The girl who wouldn't walk away. It was a cold, drizzly afternoon, the kind that makes people hurry along the sidewalk with their heads down, hands stuffed deep into their pockets. The kind of day when most people are too busy thinking about getting home, getting warm, and getting on with their lives to notice anything out of the ordinary. But 12-year-old Emily Parker wasn't most people. She had always been the kind of kid who noticed things. The stray dog trembling behind a dumpster, the old man struggling with his groceries, the lonely girl in her class who sat alone at lunch. Emily had a way of seeing people, really seeing them, in a way that most adults had long forgotten. And that was why, on this miserable November afternoon, she was the only one who noticed the baby. She had been walking home from school, her backpack weighed down with books, her mind drifting between the math test she had tomorrow and the peanut butter sandwich she planned to make when she got home. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something strange. A woman. She was standing at the entrance of an alleyway, her body half hidden in the shadows between two buildings. Her coat was too thin for the cold, her hair unkempt, her face pale. And in her arms, wrapped in a dirty, frayed blanket, was a baby. Emily slowed her pace, frowning. Something about the way the woman stood, stiff, motionless, sent a shiver down her spine. People didn't just stand like that, not in the middle of a busy street, not without reason. And then, just as Emily was about to keep walking, the woman did something that made her heart stop. She placed the baby on the ground. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't careful. It was desperate. Emily froze. For a moment, she thought she had imagined it. Maybe the woman was just adjusting her grip. Maybe she was about to kneel down and check on the baby. But no. The woman straightened. Then, without looking back, she turned and walked away. Emily's breath hitched in her throat. She stared, waiting, hoping the woman would turn around, that she had just needed a moment. But the woman didn't come back. She kept walking, her pace quickening, her shoulders hunched, until she disappeared around the corner. And just like that, the baby was alone. Emily's heart pounded. She looked around, expecting someone else to react. An adult, a passerby, a shopkeeper from one of the nearby stores. But no one did. People kept moving, umbrellas bobbing in the light rain, footsteps tapping against the wet pavement. She was the only one who had seen, the only one who could do something. Emily's feet moved before she could think. She hurried toward the alleyway, her breath coming fast and shallow. When she reached the baby, she hesitated for only a second before crouching down. The baby was tiny, too tiny. Emily didn't know much about babies, but she had seen enough of her neighbor's newborn to know that this one didn't look right. Its cheeks were sunken, its skin pale. It wasn't crying. Was that normal? Shouldn't babies cry? Her hand shook as she reached out and pulled back the blanket. Her stomach twisted. The baby's clothes were soaked through. Its lips were slightly blue. It was freezing. Panic rose in Emily's chest. She didn't know what to do. She needed help. But who? She didn't have a phone. Should she yell? Should she run into one of the stores? Should she? No, there was no time. Her hands moved on instinct. She wrapped the baby tightly in its thin blanket. Then, without thinking twice, lifted it into her arms. She had never carried a baby before. It was lighter than she expected, but fragile, so fragile she was afraid she might break it. But there was no other choice. Emily took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and started walking. No, running. The hospital was only 5 blocks away. She knew because she had passed it 100 times on the way to school. 5 blocks. That wasn't far. She could make it. She had to make it. The rain picked up, turning from a drizzle into a steady patter. Her sneakers slapped against the pavement. Her breath came in sharp gasps. She held the baby close to her chest, shielding it as best as she could. She didn't stop. Not when her legs burned. Not when people stared. Not when her arms ached from holding the baby so tightly. She ran like her life depended on it. But really, it wasn't her life. It was his. The baby in her arms. By the time she reached the hospital doors, her lungs felt like they might burst. She stumbled inside, her shoes squeaking against the polished floor. The warmth of the hospital lobby hit her like a wave, but she didn't have time to register it. She looked around wildly. There was a front desk, a nurse behind it, people sitting in chairs, but she didn't care about any of them. She focused on the nurse. Emily took one last step forward, her entire body trembling, and forced herself to speak. 2 words. Just 2 words. Help him. And that was all it took. The nurse's eyes widened. In an instant, she was on her feet, reaching for the baby, shouting for help. Other nurses appeared. A doctor. Hands grabbed the baby from Emily's arms. People moved fast, faster than Emily had ever seen adults move. And then, before she could even catch her breath, someone was dialing 911. Emily didn't understand why. Not yet. All she knew was that she had done something. She had saved a life. But she had no idea that this was only the beginning, the question that changed everything. Emily sat in the stiff plastic chair of the hospital waiting room, her small hands still trembling, her heart hammering in her chest. The baby was gone, whisked away by a team of doctors and nurses who had moved with a kind of urgency she had never seen before. The warmth of the hospital should have made her feel safe. The bright overhead lights, the clean white walls, the hushed murmurs of doctors and nurses. It was a place where people were supposed to get help. But Emily didn't feel safe. She felt lost. She wasn't supposed to be here. She was just a kid who had walked home from school, just like any other day, only to find herself in the middle of something so much bigger than she could understand. Her soaked hoodie clung to her skin, her sneakers left wet footprints on the white tile floor. The rain outside still pounded against the glass windows of the emergency room, but Emily barely noticed. All she could think about was the baby. Was he okay? Had she been fast enough? What if she hadn't stopped? Her stomach twisted. She wrapped her arms around herself, squeezing tight, trying to hold back the fear creeping up her spine. And then, "Sweetheart." Emily looked up. The nurse from earlier was standing in front of her. She was an older woman, her short gray hair neatly tucked behind her ears, her blue scrubs crisp and clean. But her face was lined with something that looked like both relief and concern. Emily swallowed. Is he okay?" Her voice was small, barely above a whisper. The nurse knelt down, resting a gentle hand on Emily's shoulder. "You saved his life." The words should have made her feel better, but the way the nurse said them, the way her voice wavered ever so slightly, made Emily's stomach clench even tighter. Something was wrong. "Then why did you call 911? The words left Emily's mouth before she could stop them. The question had been gnawing at her since the moment she had heard the nurse's urgent voice on the phone. This was a hospital. They had doctors, nurses, people who saved lives every single day. So why? The nurse hesitated. And in that hesitation, Emily knew, whatever was happening, whatever was going on with that baby, it wasn't just a medical emergency. The nurse sighed, then sat down beside Emily in the waiting chair, her eyes searching hers. "We needed to report it." "Report what?" Another pause. "Sweetheart," the nurse said softly, "that baby, he was starving." Emily's breath caught. He wasn't just cold. He wasn't just abandoned. He hadn't been fed properly in a long time. His little body was so weak. The nurse shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. "That's not something that happens overnight." Emily gripped the edge of her hoodie, twisting the damp fabric in her fists. "Are they going to find the mom?" she asked, even though she already knew the answer. The nurse gave a small nod. "The police are on their way now." Emily's chest tightened. She should have been relieved. After all, wasn't this what was supposed to happen? Wasn't this what adults did? They fixed things. They made sure babies didn't get left in alleyways. They made sure people got help. But the look in the nurse's eyes told Emily something else. This wasn't going to be simple, because this wasn't just about a baby. This was about the woman who had left him there. And for some reason, the thought of that woman being in trouble made Emily's stomach hurt. She hadn't looked like a monster. She had looked broken. The arrival of the police. Emily didn't have to wait long. The glass doors to the emergency room slid open, and 2 police officers stepped inside. One was tall and broad-shouldered, his uniform crisp and his face unreadable. The other was a woman, her dark brown hair pulled back into a tight ponytail, her expression softer, but just as serious. Emily stiffened. The nurse stood, walking over to greet them, lowering her voice as she spoke. Emily couldn't hear everything, but she caught bits and pieces. Brought the baby in herself. Found him abandoned. Mother nowhere in sight. The taller officer's gaze flickered toward Emily, and she quickly looked down at her hands. She didn't know why she suddenly felt so nervous. She hadn't done anything wrong. Had she? The female officer approached her, kneeling down so she was at eye level. "Hi, Emily," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "I'm Officer Martinez. I just have a few questions for you. Is that okay?" Emily nodded hesitantly. The officer gave her a small smile. "You did a really brave thing today." Emily swallowed. "Is he going to be okay?" "The doctors are taking care of him," Officer Martinez said. "But right now, we need to figure out where he came from. Can you tell me everything you remember?" Emily nodded again, then took a deep breath and started talking. She told them about walking home, about seeing the woman standing in the alleyway, about the way she had put the baby down and walked away. She told them about running, about how scared she had been, about the 2 words she had said when she had finally reached the hospital. Officer Martinez listened carefully, nodding every so often, not interrupting until Emily was finished. When she was done, the officer was silent for a moment. Then she asked the question Emily had been dreading. "If we find the mother, do you think she wanted to hurt him?" Emily's chest tightened. She thought about the woman's face, the way her shoulders had slumped, the way she had walked away, not quickly, not like someone trying to escape, but like someone who had no other choice. Emily bit her lip. Then, finally, she shook her head. "No," she said quietly. "I don't think she wanted to hurt him." Officer Martinez studied her. Then, with a small nod, she stood. "Thank you, Emily," she said. "You did the right thing." But as Emily watched the officers walk toward the hospital doors, she couldn't help but wonder. If she had really done the right thing, why did it feel so wrong? The woman in the rain. Emily couldn't sleep that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the soft hum of the city outside her window failing to lull her into rest. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the baby's tiny, pale face. She heard the woman's footsteps disappearing down that dark alley. She had saved the baby. Everyone kept telling her that. The nurses, the police, even her mom, when she had finally come to pick her up from the hospital after the whole ordeal. "You did a brave thing, sweetheart," her mom had whispered, wrapping her in a hug so tight Emily could barely breathe. But for some reason, it didn't feel brave. Because all Emily could think about was the woman. Who was she? Where had she gone? And why? Why had she left her baby behind? A whispered conversation. The next morning, Emily sat at the breakfast table, picking at her toast. Her mom was on the phone, speaking in hushed tones, but Emily caught enough to know exactly what she was talking about. "Yes, she's still a little shaken up. I know. What kind of mother does that? Leaving a baby in an alleyway?" The police shoaled. Emily's stomach twisted. She didn't want to hear the rest. She grabbed her jacket and slipped out the door before her mom could stop her. She didn't know exactly where she was going, but before she even realized it, her feet had led her back to the hospital. It wasn't raining today, but the clouds still hung low and gray in the sky. The hospital lobby smelled like antiseptic and the same nurse from the night before. Janice, Emily remembered, was sitting at the front desk, typing something into a computer. The moment she saw Emily, her eyes softened. "Back already?" she asked. Emily hesitated, then nodded. "I wanted to know if the baby is okay." Janice sighed, rubbing the back of her neck. "He's stable. They're keeping him for a while, though. He was in worse shape than we thought." Emily's heart sank. Janice studied her for a moment, then lowered her voice. "The police are still looking for his mother, but they found something." Emily's breath caught. "What?" Janice hesitated, glancing around as if to make sure no one else was listening. Then she leaned in slightly. "They found a shelter where she used to stay. She's been homeless for a while." Emily's chest tightened. Homeless. That changed everything. She had pictured a woman who had been overwhelmed, who had made a mistake, but homeless. That meant she hadn't just given up. She had been desperate. Emily swallowed hard. Did they find her? Janice shook her head. Not yet. Emily nodded, but her mind was already spinning. There had to be a way to find her. The shelter. Emily didn't tell her mom where she was going. She just said she was going for a walk, but in reality, she was retracing her steps. Back to where she had first seen the woman, back to the alleyway where it had all begun. And from there, she started asking questions. It was scary at first. She wasn't used to talking to strangers, but she forced herself to be brave. She asked the man at the newspaper stand if he had seen a woman carrying a baby that day. She asked a street vendor if he had noticed anyone fitting her description. Most people shrugged. Some gave her odd looks. But then, the old shelter on 6th Street. Emily turned sharply. It was a woman, bundled up in an oversized coat, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. She stayed there for a while, the woman said. Didn't talk much. Real quiet, always worried about the baby. Emily's heart pounded. Do you know where she is now? The woman shook her head. She left a couple days ago. Said she couldn't stay. Emily's throat tightened. Do you know why? The woman hesitated, then sighed. They don't let you keep babies in most shelters. They don't have the resources for it. Emily's stomach twisted. She hadn't abandoned her baby because she wanted to. She had abandoned him because she had to. The search. Emily didn't stop. She went to the shelter on 6th Street, where a tired-looking volunteer confirmed that a woman matching her description had stayed there. She had left suddenly, without telling anyone where she was going. Emily knew the police were already looking for her, but she wasn't convinced they were looking in the right places, because the police were searching for a criminal. Emily was searching for a mother, and mothers didn't just disappear. She had to be somewhere, and Emily was going to find her. The face in the crowd. Emily had never been to this part of the city before. The streets were narrower, the buildings older, the sidewalks cracked and uneven. People moved quickly, their heads down, shoulders hunched against the cold. The air smelled different here, not unpleasant, just worn, like rain-soaked cardboard and distant cooking oil, like people who had been walking for too long without a destination. She pulled her hoodie tighter around her as she walked. She had spent the entire day searching, asking questions, listening to stories. Some people ignored her. Some just shook their heads. A few pointed her toward places where homeless people gathered, under bridges, near abandoned buildings, in the quiet corners of bus stations. But still, she hadn't found the woman. She was starting to lose hope. Maybe the police had already found her. Maybe she was gone. Maybe. And then, just as she was about to turn back, she saw her. It was just for a second. A glimpse through the crowd of people waiting at a bus stop. A figure sitting alone on a bench, hunched over, wrapped in an oversized coat, her face hidden behind tangled strands of hair. But Emily knew. She didn't know how she knew. She just did. It was her. The woman who had left the baby in the alley. Her breath caught. Her heart pounded against her ribs. This was it. She had found her. But now what? The conversation that changed everything. Emily hesitated. She knew she should tell the police. That was what she was supposed to do. But something deep inside her told her to wait. This woman wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. She was just sitting. So Emily took a deep breath, steeled herself, and walked forward. As she approached, the woman didn't look up. She was staring down at her hands, clasped tightly in her lap. Emily swallowed hard. Then, carefully, she sat down beside her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, "You found him, didn't you?" The woman's voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. Emily turned to look at her, but the woman still didn't meet her gaze. "You're the girl from the hospital," she murmured. "The one who took him." Emily's throat tightened. "He's okay," she said softly. "The doctors took care of him." The woman exhaled shakily, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her coat. "I knew someone would," she whispered. Emily hesitated. Then, finally, she asked the question that had been burning in her mind since the very beginning. "Why did you leave him?" The woman flinched. For a long time, she didn't answer. Then, "Because I had no other choice." Her voice cracked on the last word. Emily waited, giving her time, giving her space. And slowly, hesitantly, the woman began to talk. The story no one knew. Her name was Sarah. She had once had a job, an apartment, a life that wasn't like this. But then, everything had fallen apart. Her husband had left. She had lost her job. The bills had stacked up. And then she had found out she was pregnant. At first, she had believed she could handle it. She had tried. She had fought. But the world wasn't kind to people who had nothing. No landlord would rent to her without an income. No shelter would take both her and the baby. No job would hire her when she had no place to shower, no way to pay for childcare. She had spent months fighting for a way to keep them together. And then, one night, the baby had stopped crying. Not because he was asleep, not because he was content, but because he was too weak to cry anymore. That was when she had known. She had to let him go. "I thought if I left him somewhere safe," she whispered, "someone would help him. Someone who could." She let out a ragged breath, her eyes filling with tears. "But I didn't want to leave him. I didn't want to. Her voice broke. "I had no choice." Emily felt something tighten in her chest. She had spent days searching for this woman, expecting to find. What? A heartless mother. A criminal. But instead, she had found someone who loved her baby so much that she had done the hardest thing a mother could ever do. Let him go. A second chance. Emily took a deep breath. Then, carefully, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper. A phone number. Janice, the nurse from the hospital, had given it to her before she left. It was for a woman who worked with families in crisis, who helped mothers and children stay together. "You don't have to do this alone," Emily said softly, holding out the paper. "There are people who want to help you." Sarah stared at it. Her hand shook as she reached for it, her fingers barely brushing the edge of the paper before she pulled back. "I don't deserve to be his mother," she whispered. Emily's chest tightened. "You left him because you wanted him to live," she said. "That means you love him. And that means you do deserve to be his mom." Sarah's breath hitched. For the first time, she looked up. Her eyes, red-rimmed, tired, hollow, met Emily's. And for the first time, there was something else there too. Hope. A new beginning. Sarah stood in the hospital hallway, her fingers clutching the hem of her borrowed sweater. The hospital staff had cleaned her up. They had given her food, warm clothes, and most importantly, they had given her a choice. For the first time in a long time, she had something she hadn't dared to believe she would ever have again. A chance. Emily stood beside her, hands stuffed in her pockets, watching anxiously as a nurse disappeared through the door at the end of the hall. Sarah's heart pounded. The baby, Her baby was in that room. She had dreamed about this moment every night since she had left him behind. She had imagined walking in and holding him, whispering over and over that she was sorry, that she loved him. But now that she was here, she wasn't sure she could do it. What if he didn't know her? What if he cried when she touched him? What if she had already lost him, even before she had the chance to fight for him? She turned to Emily, her voice shaking. What if it's too late? Emily didn't hesitate. It's not. Sarah swallowed hard. Then the door opened. The nurse stepped out, gave her a small nod, and gestured for her to go inside. Sarah's legs felt like lead as she stepped forward. Her breath came fast and shallow. And then she saw him. A tiny bundle wrapped in a soft hospital blanket, lying in a crib by the window. His little chest rose and fell, his tiny fingers curled into delicate fists. His lips, no longer blue, no longer cracked, moved slightly in his sleep. Her baby. Her son. Sarah felt her knees go weak. The nurse beside the crib looked up and smiled. Would you like to hold him? She couldn't speak. She could only nod. She reached out, her hands trembling as they slipped beneath his tiny body, lifting him carefully into her arms. He was warm. For the first time in weeks, he was warm. Tears blurred her vision as she held him close, pressing her lips against the top of his head. And then, he made a sound. A soft, breathy little noise. It wasn't a cry. It wasn't a whimper. It was something else. Recognition. Sarah let out a shaky sob. He knew her. Despite everything. Despite the time, the distance, the cold nights, the empty stomach, he still knew her, and he hadn't given up on her. Not yet. Not ever. One final goodbye, or a new hello. Emily stood just outside the door, watching. Her chest ached, but not in a bad way. In a way that made her feel full. She had done what she came to do. She had found the woman. She had brought her back. And now she was watching a mother and child find each other again. She didn't need to stay. She had been a bridge, nothing more, a moment in their lives that had helped lead them back to each other. She turned to go, but before she could take a step, Sarah's voice stopped her. Emily. She turned back. Sarah's eyes were still wet with tears, but there was something else in them now. Something lighter. Something alive. Thank you, she whispered. Emily smiled. And then, just as she was about to step into the hallway, Sarah spoke again. Would you like to hold him? Emily froze. She had never held a baby before. She wasn't sure she knew how. But as Sarah extended her arms, offering Emily the tiny, fragile life she had fought so hard to save, she knew she couldn't say no. She stepped forward, carefully taking the baby into her arms. He was warm. He was safe. And for the first time in a long time, so was Sarah. So was Emily. And maybe, just maybe, so was the world. The ripple effect. Months passed. Seasons changed. Sarah got help. She found shelter, support, a job. It wasn't easy. There were nights when she wanted to give up, when the weight of rebuilding a life from nothing felt impossible. But she didn't, because now she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for him, and she wasn't alone anymore. One day, on a crisp spring afternoon, Emily sat in a park, flipping through a book, when she heard someone call her name. She looked up. Sarah was there, and in her arms was a chubby-cheeked, wide-eyed baby, bundled up in a tiny blue sweater. Emily's breath caught. He's doing great, Sarah said, smiling. And so am I. Emily grinned, and as she reached out to take the baby's tiny hand in hers, she realized something. She hadn't just saved a life that day in the hospital. She had changed one. Maybe even two. Maybe even more than she would ever know. And maybe, just maybe, that was what being the hero really meant. Not just saving lives, but changing them. For good. For always.